Hey there, Honors English 2 students. Today we are tackling the third component for our rhetorical analyses. Today we are going to be taking a look at rhetorical devices. And just a reminder, this is where we really dig deep into close reading. So we've already covered our initial soapstone considerations where we look at those baseline components of speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, and tone. We have tackled rhetorical appeals, appeals to emotion and logic, appeals to credibility. And now today we are going to be looking at the rhetorical devices that authors and speakers use in order to convey their main ideas and also to accomplish more specific purposes. So our rhetorical devices are broken up into two different categories, and these are the categories we are going to cover. A reminder to you that you are responsible for all of the terms we are learning and have learned so far. So anything that has a definition, anything that is highlighted, tropes and schemes right here, all of these definitions you are responsible for knowing. So let's jump right in. When we talk about tropes, we are talking about artful variations from the typical or expected way that a word or idea is expressed. It is the figurative use of a word. So tropes focus on the significance of word choice, which we refer to as diction. So again, tropes are those figurative devices. We're going to jump into what those types of devices are in just a moment. Schemes, on the other hand, deal with structure, is what I would say. So I find it easiest to remember that schemes means structure because both of those words start with an S. So scheme is an artful variation from the typical arrangement of words in a sentence. We also refer to that as syntax. So schemes are related to that sentence structure, and when we talk structure, another word for that would be syntax. So tropes deal with word choice. Tropes deal with more figurative use of language. Schemes deal with structure. So tropes, the different types we have tropes involving comparison, tropes involving wordplay and sounds, and then tropes involving overstatement or understatement. You don't necessarily have to remember which one of these categories each of the devices falls into in terms of comparison or wordplay or overstatement, but you should be able to identify that this device is a trope and this device is a scheme. So let's remember. Again, tropes focus on significance of word choice. So the tropes involving comparison, these have the effect of using imagery to create and enhance meaning. Comparative tropes include allusion, apostrophe, metaphor, simile, and personification. Now, some of these terms are going to sound familiar, and some of them are going to be new. So the ones that are familiar, wonderful. Y'all will be very comfortable with those, but there will be some new terms as well, and you are responsible for them all. So, allusion is a brief reference to a real or fictitious person, place, event, or work of art. You should be familiar with that one. So, for example, a reference to Eden, Scrooge, or Picasso in a work is an allusion. Apostrophe is addressing a person in a speech or composition who is not present. For example, O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? In Romeo and Juliet, that is an apostrophe because Romeo, according to Juliet, is not actually there. Oftentimes, apostrophe tends to be a reference to or addressing someone who is actually dead, or death itself, but the idea is you are addressing someone or something who is not present. Metaphor, we should know backwards and forwards, that is an expression of meaning that compares two unlike things without using like or as to make that comparison. So here we see an example from President Ronald Reagan's inaugural address. Simile is a comparison of two unlike things using the words like or as. So the example, the young girl is as brave as a lion. Comparing the young girl to a lion using the word as. That would be a simile. Personification is giving inanimate objects human characteristics. We've got an example right there. Personifying lightning. Moving on to tropes involving word play and sounds. These have the effect of using sounds to create and enhance meaning. So we've got alliteration, assonance, consonance, and onomatopoeia. So alliteration, we should know, is the repetition of the same letter at the beginning of adjacent or closely placed words. So we can see this in President Barack Obama's speech at the Fort Hood Memorial Service, the repetition of that F sound at the beginning of those three words. That is alliteration. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds between different consonants inside a line. So we see this example of assonance from the famous poet Eminem. All right, consonance is the repetition of the same consonant sounds repeated in a group of words. So slightly different from alliteration, where alliteration is at the beginning of the words. Consonance is typically inside of the words, but is also repeating the same consonant sound. Onomatopoeia is the intentional use of words that sound like their meaning. These ones y'all probably learned really long time ago, like in elementary school. Next, we have tropes involving statement. So these have the effect of using exaggerations to create or enhance meanings. These ones include hyperbole, oxymoron, and rhetorical questions. Hyperbole is a gross exaggeration to make an effect or to highlight something. We can see this hyperbole in FDR's first inaugural address. This line should sound familiar to y'all. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That is an exaggeration. Oxymoron, we should be familiar with. It's the intentional use of an apparent contradiction. Phrases like Great Depression, jumbo shrimp, only choice. Next, we've got rhetorical questions. This is the purposeful inclusion of a question intended not to be answered, but to evoke deep thought. The purpose of these is for people to consider what you are asking in that question. So why should we even learn to read anyways? That is a rhetorical question, not meant to be answered. So as a recap, tropes include allusion, apostrophe, metaphor, simile, personification, alliteration, assonance, consonance, onomatopoeia, hyperbole, oxymoron, and rhetorical questions. Moving on, we have schemes that involve balance, schemes that involve omission, and schemes that involve repetition. And to remind you, schemes deal with structure, or what we also call syntax. Okay? So schemes vary from the typical arrangement of words in a sentence. So the schemes that we have that involve balance, they illustrate or highlight the importance of ideas. We've got parallel structure and juxtaposition. Parallel structure is the similarity of structure in a pair or series of related words, phrases, or clauses. So we can see in this example from President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. You can see it's not the exact same phrasing, but it is similar structure of all three of those phrases. Of the, by the, for the. That is parallel structure. Juxtaposition is the placing of two things closely together to emphasize the comparison or contrasts. So dark and light, life and death, beauty and ugliness, etc., etc. We are juxtaposing two ideas closely together. Schemes involving omission deal with asyndeton and polysyndeton. This is when writers purposely leave things out in order to highlight an idea. Asyndeton is the purposeful omission of words by which the meaning is still clear because of the context. We know that this is when we typically see these lists without contractions. So I came, I saw, I conquered. Asyndeton and polysyndeton both impact the pacing of the line. So we notice with asyndeton, it tends to speed up what we are saying. With polysyndeton, it slows down what we are saying, and in both ways, we are emphasizing a certain idea. So with polysyndeton, we would want to ask, why would it be important for an author to slow down while discussing those ideas? And in the same vein, with asyndeton, we would want to say, what does this quicker pacing in this phrase, I came, I saw, I conquered, what does the quicker pacing do to the reader? Why would we have a quicker pacing of these ideas? What does quicker pacing do? It creates some sort of urgency, potentially, but you want to ask those questions about why would I quicken the pace or slow down the pace, specifically when it comes to these ideas and what is being said in these phrases. So, like I said, polysyndeton, the flip side of asyndeton, is the literary technique that uses conjunctions in repeated succession, oftentimes with no commas, but the commas are not a make and break of polysyndeton. So the repetitive use of those conjunctions. Again, polysyndeton slows down the pacing, and we would want to then ask why. It's not just enough to identify that the author is using any of these devices. We need to not only identify them, but then understand how they function and for what purpose they are functioning rhetorically. So how does a slowing of the pace allow the author to better communicate their idea and accomplish their purpose? Okay, we have to make sure we make those links between these devices and what they accomplish. Okay, sorry about that. My computer went glitchy. All right, seams involving repetition. We have anadiplosis, anaphora, and chiasmus. So these use repetition for emphasis to make a text memorable, forceful, and artistic. So anadiplosis is the repetition of the last word of one clause at the beginning of the next. This is one of my favorites, and it's really neat. Doesn't make a lot of sense maybe initially from the definition, but when you see it in action, you're like, oh, I get it. And this just happens to be from one of my favorite movies. So the anadiplosis you see is in those words that are bolded and underlined. So the general who became a slave, and then we repeat that last word, slave, as at the beginning of the next phrase. The slave who became a gladiator, and then we take that last word, gladiator, and we use it at the beginning of the next phrase. The gladiator who defied an emperor. Okay, that is the anadiplosis. And again, it's not just enough to identify it. We would want to ask, what is this doing? How is this accomplishing the overall purpose? Why would the author structure this in this way? And what is the impact of that structure? All right, anaphora, we have the repetition of a phrase for emphasis. You can see here in Winston Churchill's House of Commons that repetition of that phrase, we shall fight, we shall fight, we shall fight. And some of you guys already even noticed that as we looked at the Day of Infamy, and you noticed the repetition of certain phrases in that speech. That is anaphora. That is what we would label it as if we want to be specific. You can, of course, call these things repetition because that is what it is, but the actual device when we are repeating a specific phrase over and over is anaphora. And again, we would then ask ourselves, why is it important to repeat this phrase, we shall fight? And then what ultimately is Winston Churchill trying to accomplish through this repetition? And that starts bringing us to that final component of a rhetorical analysis, okay? We are putting all the puzzle pieces together at this point. Chiasmus is another one of my favorites. It occurs when the first clause or the phrase is reversed in the second. Sometimes it will repeat the same words. Other times it's just a repetition of the same structure or a reverse of the structure and not necessarily a reverse of the exact same words. So we see in JFK's first inaugural address, and so my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. You see that ask not what your country can do for you is literally flipped. Ask what you can do for your country. So chiasmus is like an XY, YX pattern. Doesn't always have to be the exact same words, but has that flipping of the first clause. So the first clause is literally like mirrored or reflected in the second clause. All right, so to review our schemes, we have parallel structure, juxtaposition, asyndeton, polysyndeton, anadiplosis, anaphora, and chiasmus. And that finishes us up for our tropes and schemes. Hopefully you took plenty of notes. You are responsible not only for knowing the definitions of these terms, but also for being able to identify their use in a text.